KPCOFGS, and that means kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species with a KPCOFGS.
Welcome to another virtual biology lecture. Today we're going to be discussing classification of living things. Hope you guys enjoy and don't forget to take good notes. Today's virtual lecture's objective is to become familiar with the following assessment standards from reporting category 3 that are going to be tested in the STAR Biology EOC. At the end of the lecture, you should be able to define taxonomy and its importance, as well as be able to categorize organisms using the levels of classification, and also be able to compare characteristics of taxonomic groups. There are millions of different kinds of living things on Earth, which is why it's unimaginable to expect everyone and every language to identify and describe each living organism the same way. Or is it? Taxonomy is the science of describing, naming, and classifying organisms based on their characteristics and evolutionary relationships. But how do you avoid confusion due to language and geographical barriers within the scientific community? As you might imagine, these types of barriers may pose problems when scientists from different parts of the world are attempting to share scientific findings regarding certain living organisms. For instance, let's say a group of scientists are working on research regarding how to neutralize skunk spray. You know, that really bad smell that comes from a skunk when it gets scared? Well, believe it or not, simply being able to identify which living organism they're all referring to may be a problem due to different languages and common names that are used. For instance, in Italy, skunks are actually known as moufette, or in Russia, they're known as skuns, and in China, they're actually referred to as choyo. Overall, this would cause way too much confusion in trying to translate all of these languages. So instead, taxonomists, which are scientists that study taxonomy, decided to stay away from common names and use a universal system in classifying all living things. In order to avoid confusion, all scientists refer to an organism with the same name rather than remembering all of the common names used for that organism around the world. Overall, the importance of taxonomy is to be able to identify the organism properly and find evolutionary relationships between species, which is what this video lecture is actually going to be discussing. But first, we must understand what is considered living and what is not. Not all scientists agree exactly on what is considered living. There's just not one distinguishing feature that separates a living thing from a non-living thing. Therefore, biologists now define life by listing characteristics that living things share, which means that something that has all of these characteristics of life can be considered to be alive. Now, an individual living creature is actually considered an organism, and there are many characteristics that living organisms share. For instance, they're able to respond to their environment. Basically, all living things know what's going on around them, and they respond to changes in the environment. This is where adaptations play a role. They all must grow and change as well. Even the smallest, such as bacteria, they have to grow because remember, bacteria reproduce by dividing into two. But if the parent bacterium doesn't grow, then each subsequent generation will just be smaller, which will ultimately be non-functional. This is why even bacteria must grow and then divide. Now, they all reproduce and have offspring as well. Now, keep in mind that there are two types of reproduction. Remember that sexual reproduction produces offspring that are genetically unique and increases genetic variation within a species. Now, the other type of reproduction is asexual reproduction, which involves only one parent, and it occurs without the fusion of gametes, and it produces offspring that are genetically identical to the parent. Now, they all also have metabolisms. In other words, they must be able to obtain energy through a series of chemical reactions. All living things also maintain homeostasis. In other words, they are all able to keep their internal environments within a certain stable range despite the changes in their external environment. Lastly, all living things are built out of structures called cells. In other words, all living organisms are made up of one or more cells. Even bacteria, which simply consist of one cell, whereas you, on the other hand, are made of trillions of cells. Now, as you can imagine, we're surrounded by many living things in our ecosystem, which is basically a biological community of interacting organisms and their physical environment. Now, in ecology, which we're going to discuss in later lectures, we refer to all living things in an ecosystem as biotic factors, and all the non-living things as abiotic factors. Now, as we mentioned before, living things all share some common characteristics, which classifies them as living. Yet, there is great diversity in the forms and structures of each organism. So in order to help understand and organize information about these diverse life forms, scientists have devised a system for classifying them, in which they arrange organisms into orderly groups known as taxa, based on their similarities when analyzing and comparing their physical structures, patterns of development, chemical processes, and even DNA. Taxa are the categories used to group related organisms. Now, there's a hierarchy of taxa from broadest to most specific. There are 8 major levels of classification, which are usually illustrated as an upside-down pyramid, starting with domain, then kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. As you move from the top to the bottom of this hierarchy of taxa, each classification becomes more specific, which means that organisms within each category are more closely related as you move from the domain level towards the species level. Which is why it's important that you remember the correct sequence of the levels of classification. I always remember this sequence with this mnemonic device. Did King Philip come over for great soup? If you remember this question, then you can easily remember that each of the first letters represents each of the levels of classification, and that they are all in order from broadest to most specific. In other words, the most specific level is the species level, which means that organisms found in the same species are those that are the most closely related, which is why species are seen as a group of organisms that share similar characteristics and can interbreed to produce fertile offspring, meaning there's only one type of organism in each species group. For example, the coyote belongs to the species Canis lantris, while the wolf, a close relative of the coyote, belongs to the species Canis lupus. Notice that they both share the previous levels of classification, all the way down to the genus known as Canis. But the species level is different, since a coyote and a wolf cannot produce fertile offspring, which means that they must belong to different species. Now, let's go over more details and examples of each level of classification, starting with the broadest level at the top, known as domain. Remember that we learned about 2 types of cells, those that have a nucleus, which are called eukaryotic, and those that do not, which are referred to as prokaryotic. Well, scientists use this difference between cell types to sort out living things in the most broadest level of classification, known as the domain. There are 3 domains. The first 2, bacteria and archaeobacteria, consist of unicellular prokaryotes. Basically, they are prokaryotic cells which have no nucleus nor membrane-bound organelles. The third is eukarya, as you might think consists of eukaryotes, which are more complex cells that have a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. The level below the domain is the kingdom. Now, there are 6 commonly accepted kingdoms. The kingdom Eubacteria, which is actually the only kingdom found under the domain bacteria, consists of single-celled prokaryotes which lack a membrane-bound nucleus and organelles. The distinguishing features of Eubacteria is a cell wall made up of peptidoglycan, and this group of bacteria can actually live inside of you, such as E. coli, which lives in your intestines, or Staphylococcus lives on your skin, or Streptococcus lives on your skin or throat, etc. Now, keep in mind that these bacteria may be beneficial to us or can cause harm, which we're going to focus later on in lectures. Now, kingdom Archaeobacteria, which is actually the only kingdom found under the domain Archaea, and it consists of single-celled prokaryotes which live in harsh environments. Now, this bacteria do not have peptidoglycan cell walls. An example is Cyanobacteria, which is also known as blue-green algae. Now that we've identified the kingdoms found in bacteria and archaea domains, this leaves us only with the domain eukarya, which are, as we mentioned before, consist of eukaryotes that are classified into 4 kingdoms: Animalia, which are animals, Plantae, which are plants, fungi, and Protista, or also known as protists. So let's start with the kingdom Animalia, which consist of multicellular living things with backbones known as vertebrates, or those without backbones known as invertebrates. Now, their eukaryotic cells do not contain cell walls, and they're referred to as ingestive heterotrophs because they obtain energy through cellular respiration. In other words, they must ingest glucose to release energy found in it. For instance, humans, snails, fish, sponges, sea anemones, insects, etc. Kingdom Plantae, it consists of multicellular living things that have eukaryotic cells which do have cellulose in their cell walls and are referred to as autotrophs because they obtain energy through photosynthesis. In other words, they make their own glucose by storing energy from the sun. For instance, mosses, ferns, flowering and seeded plants. Believe it or not, mushrooms and molds are not considered part of the Plantae kingdom. They have their own kingdom due to their unique characteristics, and it is called the Fungi kingdom, which consists of unicellular or multicellular living things that have eukaryotic cells with cell walls, but they're actually made out of chitin. And these cells do not carry out photosynthesis. They are actually considered absorbative heterotrophs because they digest food outside their body and then absorb it. For instance, mushrooms, molds, and yeast. Overall, most fungi are multicellular, except yeast, which are unicellular. The kingdom Protista, which most of them are single-celled, and they have a nucleus, and they come in a variety of forms. Some are autotrophs and others are heterotrophs. Euglena is a plant-like and animal-like organism. Paramecium is a unicellular organism that moves itself rapidly through water by using thousands of little cilia. Now, the amoeba changes shape constantly and flows around food to engulf it. Now, keep in mind, the other three eukaryotic kingdoms are thought to have evolved from Protista. The most closely related organisms will be those in the species level. The most distantly related will be those in the kingdom level. Now, the level that follows kingdom is phylum, which is sorted by numerous characteristics and evolutionary relationships. For instance, in the animal kingdom, phylum is assigned based on the presence or lack of the backbone and other numerous characteristics. Basically, all animals that lack a backbone are known as invertebrates. Now, there's approximately 1 million known species of invertebrates, which is why they're all classified into different phylums. For instance, the phylum Echinodermata consists of a group of animals with external spines, such as the sand dollar, starfish, sea urchin, and the sea cucumber. Now, the phylum Porifera contains animals with pores all over their bodies, known as sponges. The phylum Cnidaria includes animals such as the hydra, jellyfish, sea anemone, and the coral. These animals are characterized by having special stinging organs. Now, the phylum Mollusca is made up of animals called mollusks, such as snails, slugs, scallops, octopus, and clams. The phylum Platyhelminthes includes worms with flattened bodies such as the planaria, tapeworm, and liver fluke. Now, the phylum Nematoda includes all roundworms such as ascaris, pinworm, hookworm, and stomachworm. The phylum Anidelia includes worms with bodies made of segments such as the sandworm, leech, and earthworm. The phylum Arthropoda is the largest of all phylum of animals according to the number of species in this particular group, which it consists of animals with jointed legs and a hard external skeleton made of chitin, such as spiders, insects, and crustaceans. Okay, so unlike the invertebrates, vertebrate animals have a backbone. Most vertebrates have a spinal column made up of tiny bones called vertebrae. However, some do not. They may have their vertebrae made up of cartilage like sharks. Overall, there's approximately 40,000 species of vertebrates placed into one phylum called Chordata. Now, keep in mind that each phylum is further classified into the next level called classes. For instance, vertebrates, which are those in the phylum Chordata, can be divided into 8 different classes. First, class Aves, which includes birds, class Fish, class Reptilia, which includes reptiles, class Mammalia, and lastly, class Amphibia, which includes amphibians. As you can see, each of these classes have unique characteristics that identify them as a group. Well, these groups of classes are further subdivided into order, then family, then genus, and then lastly, species. And as you've been noticing, the number of groups seen in each level of classification increases as the specificity narrows down to the species level. But the number of different organism types in each group decreases. In other words, we start with 6 kingdoms, but each kingdom has their own phylum, and each phylum has their own class, and so on. As you can see in this illustration of the approximate number of cataloged groups. Now notice that viruses are not included in these levels of classification. Why? Well, that's because viruses do not share the same classification system as organisms, because viruses are not considered to be living. For one, viruses do not have metabolisms, and they can only reproduce using the tools from their host cell. Overall, we'll discuss viruses in greater detail in later lectures. Right now, just be aware that viruses are not placed within this classification system and that they have their own way of being classified. Taxonomy provides an organized way of naming each species uniquely. However, it can be tiresome and troublesome to use a species' complete taxonomic name when being identified. For instance, humans are not referred to as Eukarya, Animalia, Chordata, Mammalia, Primate, Hominid, Homo sapiens. Instead, we use the Linnaeus system of naming, known as binomial nomenclature. Carolus Linnaeus was an 18th century taxonomist who is often referred as the father of taxonomy. He classified organisms by their structure and developed a naming system that is still used today. Basically, his binomial nomenclature system is a two-word name, specifically the genus and the species. The system uses Latin or Greek as the common language, and we capitalize the genus but not species. Now, there's a detailed description in the International Code of Binomial Nomenclature, which contains all of the rules for naming organisms. Basically, all the names must be approved by the International Naming Congress in order to prevent duplicate names. For instance, notice that this phylogenetic tree is illustrated using the binomial nomenclature. And remember that these evolutionary relationships are determined based on homologous structures, similar embryo development, and molecular similarities in DNA. Now, evolutionary relationships can be illustrated in a phylogenetic tree in which common ancestors can be determined to be part of the same broader levels of classification. For instance, the common ancestor of gray wolves and leopards was part of the order Carnivora, illustrating the shared similarities seen between all of these species. When trying to illustrate how organisms are related based on specific shared or derived characteristics such as feathers, hair, or scales, we use cladograms, which are basically evolutionary trees illustrating adaptive traits or characteristics which may have led to speciation. For instance, take a look at this cladogram of the adaptive traits seen among members of the phylum Chordata, giving rise to the various classes including fish, reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. Notice that the presence of four-legged locomotion is an adaptive trait that led to reptiles, amphibians, and mammals. Then later, the presence of hair is an adaptive trait that led to mammals. Okay, now let's try looking at this cladogram of adaptive traits seen among members of the order primates, so that we could see how these gave rise to the various families among primates. For instance, the loss of the tail is an adaptive trait that led to chimpanzees and humans. Later, the loss of the opposable thumb on our feet led to humans. Okay, so what if we find things that we don't know and we want to know what they are? Well, we would use a taxonomic tool for identifying organisms called a dichotomous key. Dichotomous keys are used to identify organisms based on the organism's characteristics. This tool gives options as to which characteristics apply to the organism in question. Now, dichotomous keys always give two distinct choices in each step. Often they're opposites, and depending on the option that applies to that organism, the result will either lead to another set of characteristics or the actual identity of the organism. Dichotomous keys can actually be illustrated using a flowchart or a list, but they are both resembling the same information. For instance, let's pretend that we find this unknown alien creature, and we want to identify it with the alien dichotomous key. Well, we would first start with step 1, which asks if the creature has 1 or 2 eyes. Well, our creature happens to have 1 eye, which is why we would do what is stated next to our creature's trait. And in this case, it asks us to go to step 5. Now, in step 5, we are asked if our creature has 1 or more antennas or no antenna at all. Well, our creature has 2, so we would do what is asked next to that trait, and it asks us to go to step 6. once in step 6, it asks us if 1 or 2 antennas are present. And as we said before, it has 2. So that means that our creature's name is C. Okay, so now that you got the hang of it with our pretend alien dichotomous key, you should see how this would work the same way for organisms found on Earth, such as a dichotomous key for vertebrates or plants. Now remember, this tool can be illustrated as a list in step forms, which is what we saw right now, or it can be seen as a flow chart. It still works the same way. Now, don't worry, we're going to try some practice problems in class. Just be aware of what a dichotomous key is for. Okay, now that we've gone over taxonomy and the classification system, you should be familiar with the following assessment standards from reporting category 3. This concludes our virtual biology lecture on classification of living things. Hope you all took great notes and wrote down any questions or concerns that you may have so that we can discuss in class. Well, that's it. Have a great one.
KPCOFGS. Now that means kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species with a KPCOFGS.